The problem people have in dealing with reality today is that most people, particularly those who have come out of universities or similar educational experiences during the past 30, 40 years, have not developed, or only in rare individuals, have not developed the ability to understand history as this understanding was had by people in earlier generations.
Welcome to today's Manhattan Project show, The Universe Bends Towards Justice. And that was Lyndon LaRouche speaking to a group in Germany, in Mainz, Germany, in 1999. Before suggesting that a problem can be solved, it's necessary to diagnose what the problem is, and we want to begin by a diagnosis made by Lyndon LaRouche on the occasion of that meeting that you've just seen.
What is happening now is that a process, a policy process, which emerged around the world in 1971 with the decision by Nixon to destroy the Bretton Woods system. People talk about the IMF system today, but the IMF system is a corpse which was killed on August 15th, 16th, 1971, and another system was put in place of what had been originally the International Monetary Fund. This system, this monetary system, the financial system, and the changes that go with the system don't work. They never worked. So as a result, over the past nearly 30 years, we've lived in a world which was doomed. That is, as long as the world continued to make changes in policy in the same direction that previous changes had been made within this period, the world was doomed. Now, it was doomed in the sense, not in the short term, that it was going to crash the following morning, but it was doomed in the sense that certain comets, because of their orbit, are going to destroy themselves in the sun. You may see these comets coming from a long time before. And astronomers may then say, well, this comet is probably going to be destroyed in the sun when it hits the sun. But it isn't destroyed yet. It's still coming. It's still coming. It's still coming. Such has been the condition of Europe. And for example, in Germany, 1963 was a crucial year. From Britain, a movement was made against the Christian principle in the leading parties of Germany. And the move was to get rid of Adenauer, because Adenauer represented not the new social policy on which the Union parties would be based, but rather on an older policy, his policy. This was the period in which and Adenauer was pushed out. He was encouraged to, shall we say, take early retirement that year. The same year, there were assassination attempts in progress still against President Charles de Gaulle of France, and which meant the ultimate destruction of France. In the same year, Kennedy was assassinated. And with the assassination of Kennedy, the ouster of Adenauer, and the attempt to oust de Gaulle, the process was in motion, which has continued to the present day, which threatens civilization. Like a comet moving through the solar system, headed for its death in the sun. We know it's doomed because the trajectory, the orbit, dooms it, foredooms it. But it's not going to happen this week, next year, or maybe in years to come. But it will happen. Now we've come to a similar point in history, that the policies which have increasingly dominated the trends in new policy making in Western Europe, in the United States, and among countries which are dominated by the influence of Western Europe and the United States.
The United States, at the behest of the Anglo-American financial empire, has been on a course of doom since August 1971, but it accelerated 40 years ago after the September 11th, 2001 bombing of the World Trade Center. In 2007, General Wesley Clark described that clueless course toward doom, the very course you're seeing unfolding right now before your eyes in Southwest Asia. He revealed this in an interview done at that time.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me."
So it's not 5 years, but Iran, the final country on that list, is now in the crosshairs. That, everybody should consider, is the real meaning of what you keep calling, or is referred to as, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the same way that people like to talk about something called the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is really a war between NATO and Russia. Try as they might, however, with whatever war they prosecute, the elites of the once functional nations of the Anglosphere are doomed to repeat failure after failure, as with their present war's expansion in Southwest Asia. Like the Athenians, who degenerated from being the high culture that had defeated the predatory Persian Empire on the plains of Marathon in 490 BC, to become the mass murderers that without provocations would slaughter and enslave the entire population of the island of Milos in 416 BC. The Anglo-Americans still believe themselves to represent a moral force, but they have become lawless. And as a consequence, they have lost the world. Is the change, for example, the bombing of Yemen that we are witnessing right now, in the immediate aftermath and perhaps as a response to the charges of genocide presented by the government of South Africa at The Hague, an expression of power by the City of London and Wall Street, or of powerlessness? Now, Lyndon LaRouche, in the remarks we showed you, described a universal change which is unknown by the comet, but which dooms that comet. The arc of the moral universe is unknown to those that reject morality, but it does bend toward justice. Hague LaRouche this week described that change in the rules of the game in Germany, in South Africa, and the rest of the world.
To start with the situation in Germany, I think this is really the beginning of a game changer, or it is a game changer, because the farmers who have been protesting and complaining for a very, very long time against the policies of the various governments ranging back a long time, but escalating naturally with this unspeakable so-called streetlight coalition, which everybody agrees is the worst government Germany had since the Second World War. This has now erupted because the farmers and many others with them, but especially the farmers, are expressing very clearly that they see their existence threatened through a combination of ever more cuts, this time the diesel fuel subsidies, but also lots of bureaucratic rules which make their life impossible, that they're not controlling their prices. So this has erupted now, but I think what comes out in this very, very, and I must really applaud the German farmers. I think every German is extremely proud that some segment of the population, where for a long time, if you would ask people in Germany, what do you think? Everybody would say, or 99% of the people would say, Germany is crashing against the wall. These present forces, powers to be, are ruining everything which generation after generation built after the Second World War. And, but then they would normally say there's nothing you can do. And, both the coalition government and the opposition was regarded as relatively the same, with the exception naturally of the AfD, but many people thought that that is not something you can really vote because of some very problematic circles within the AfD. So, for a long time, the German situation looked really terrible because the German economy was collapsing, and especially after the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, where everybody is, suspecting that Seymour Hersh was right by saying it was the United States which did it, demanding an investigation. But, people knew that the terrible collapse of the German economy, the German agriculture, was in large part the result of the sanctions against Russia, which, were really forced upon Germany, that Germany had to carry them out as part of the general transatlantic policy, but also the increase of the energy prices. The gas from Russia was no longer available. So everybody had the feeling the country is going down and down and down, and there is no force which has the guts to do something about it. And now, basically, you had on Monday more than 100,000 tractors, and there are many videos circulating in the internet. 100,000 tractors, that's a lot of long lines, and in demonstrations took place in 100 cities in all 16 states, and they were supported by the truckers, by workers from the construction sector bringing in their trucks or their cement machines or other construction machines, but also craftsmen. But also, if you go through some towns in Germany, you see in the windows they have signs, "We support the fight of the German farmers." So I think this is now the beginning of something which I cannot see how this can be undone, because the action by the farmers has given the farmers a new sense of confidence about what they can do. And if you listen to them, it was extremely peaceful, contrary to a vicious attempt before the demonstration to criminalize it by saying it's subverted by right-wing circles. Then they tried to blow up an incident where the economic minister Hague came back from an island in the North Sea, and his ferry was then trying to dock in Schleswig-Holstein in a little port. And then farmers tried to talk to him. Reconstructing it, nothing really big happened. It was not a violent attack, but the captain of the ferry decided to turn the ferry around and not go to land with Habeck. So this was blown up as a big thing, as this is the sign that these farmers are trying to topple the state. I think nothing of that sort. The former head of the police trade union went, totally ridiculized all of these attempts. And, everybody praised the farmers, the police, they praised the collaboration of the police with the farmers. So I think this was a very excellent demonstration of statecraft, of really taking responsibility. And naturally, this will go on, I would think, until the Streetlight Coalition takes these cuts back, which we will see. There are more demonstrations for the whole week. Next Monday, on the 15th, they have called for a huge national demonstration, and the whole week local demonstrations with cutting off highway access to highways and blocking roads is going to continue. And today, the strike of the locomotive trade union is going on for 3 days. So I think that there is a real shift in Germany. And the good thing is, and that's also being reported by all the media, that about 90% of the population support the farmers, and only 10, people say they're disturbing my daily work and this. But people really understand that the German farmers are fighting the fight for all of Germany. So I think this is excellent. And there are farmers all over the world who are sending support telegrams. And if you listen to this show and you have anything to do, or even if you don't have anything to do with farming, send support telegrams, make short videos to the German farmers, because I think they are right now the spearhead of the fight to put the economy back in a correct on a correct basis.
Okay, so we've designed today's program to cover two primary stories. The first is what happened at The Hague, and we have David Shaven, who will be with us to describe that. And then we will follow that by an extensive discussion, both of the German farmer circumstance and also responses to that circumstance, international responses, and that'll be done by Bob Baker. What we're going to do now is to show some excerpts from what was a 3-hour presentation that was done at The Hague, but we're only going to show here about 10 minutes of that by the arguments opening and closing that were provided by South Africa, and we will actually have a bit of a response, a rebuttal by Israel as well. So we'll start with the first of those excerpts.
Madam President and distinguished members of the court, it is a privilege to appear before the court on behalf of South Africa. I will address Israel's genocidal intent. At this stage, the court is not required to determine that the only inference to be drawn from the available evidence is genocidal, to order provisional measures, as that is to decide the merits. Rather, the assessment of the existence of an intent to destroy could be made by the court only at the stage of the examination of the merits. That some of the alleged acts may also amount to atrocities other than genocide does not exclude the finding of plausible acts of genocide. Madam President, South Africa is not alone in drawing attention to Israel's genocidal rhetoric against Palestinians in Gaza. 15 United Nations special rapporteurs and 21 members of the United Nations working groups have warned that what is happening in Gaza reflects a genocide in the making and an overt intent to destroy the Palestinian people under occupation. Israel has a genocidal intent against the Palestinians in Gaza. That is evident from the way in which Israel's military attack is being conducted, which has been described by Ms. Hassim SC. It is systematic in its character and form. The mass displacement of the population of Gaza, headed into areas where they continue to be killed, and the deliberate creation of conditions that, quote, lead to a slow death, unquote. There is also the clear pattern of conduct. the targeting of family homes and civilian infrastructure, laying waste to vast areas of Gaza, and the bombing, shelling, and sniping of men, women, and children where they stand, the destruction of their health infrastructure, and lack of access to humanitarian assistance. So much so that as we stand today, 1% of the Palestinian population in Gaza has been systematically decimated since 7 October. These two elements alone are capable of evidencing Israel's genocidal intent in relation to the whole or part of the Palestinian population in Gaza. However, third, there is an extraordinary feature in this case, that Israel's political leaders, military commanders, and persons holding official positions have systematically and in explicit terms declared their genocidal intent. And these statements are then repeated by soldiers on the ground in Gaza as they engage in the destruction of Palestinians and the physical infrastructure of Gaza. We show this third element next. Israel's special genocidal intent is rooted in the belief that, in fact, the enemy is not just the military wing of Hamas, or indeed Hamas generally, but is embedded in the fabric of Palestinian life in Gaza. On 7 October, in a televised address, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared war on Gaza, and I quote, "Israel had started clearing out the communities that have been infiltrated by terrorists." And he warned of an unprecedented price to be paid by the enemy. There are more than 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. Israel is the occupying power in control of Gaza. It controls entry, exit, and the internal movements of inside Gaza. And Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu exercises overall command over the Israeli Defense Force and, in turn, the Palestinians in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his address to the Israeli forces on 28 October 2023, preparing for the invasion of Gaza, urged the soldiers to remember what Amalek has done to you. This refers to the biblical command by God to Saul for the retaliatory destruction of an entire group of people known as the Amalekites, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. The genocidal invocation to Amalek was anything but idle. It was repeated by Mr. Netanyahu in a letter to the Israeli Armed Forces on 3 November 2023. Madam President, let the Prime Minister's words speak for themselves.
Has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember and we are fighting our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza.
Madam President, members of the Court, there is an urgent need for provisional measures to protect Palestinians in Gaza from the irreparable prejudice caused by Israel's violations of the Genocide Convention. The United Nations Secretary-General and its chiefs describe the situation in Gaza variously as a crisis of humanity, a living hell, a bloodbath, a situation of utter deepening and unmatched horror, where an entire population is besieged and under attack, denied access to the essentials for survival on a massive scale. As the United Nations Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs stated last Friday, and I quote, "Gaza has become a place of death and despair. Families are sleeping in the open as temperatures plummet. Areas where civilians were told to relocate for their safety have come under relentless bombardment. Medical facilities are under relentless attack. The few hospitals that are partially functional are overwhelmed with trauma cases, critically short of all supplies, and inundated by desperate people seeking safety. A public health disaster is unfolding. Infectious diseases are spreading in overcrowded shelters as sewers spill over. Some 180 women are giving birth daily amidst this chaos. People are facing the highest levels of food insecurity ever recorded. Famine is around the corner. For children in particular, the last 12 weeks have been traumatic. No food, no water, no school, nothing but the terrifying sounds of war, day in and day out. Gaza has simply become uninhabitable. Its people are witnessing daily threats to their very existence, while the world watches on. End quote. The court has heard of the horrific death toll and of the more than 7,000 Palestinian men, women and children reported missing, presumed dead or dying slow, excruciating deaths trapped under the rubble. Reports of field executions and torture and ill-treatment are mounting, as are images of decomposing bodies of Palestinian men, women and children left unburied where they were killed, some being picked upon by animals. It is becoming ever clearer that huge swathes of Gaza, entire towns, villages, refugee camps, are being wiped from the map. As you have heard, but it bears repeating, according to the World Food Programme, 4 out of 5 people in the world in famine or a catastrophic type of hunger are in Gaza right now. Indeed, experts warn that deaths from starvation and disease risk significantly outstripping deaths from bombings. The daily statistics stand as clear evidence of the urgency and of the irreparable prejudice. On the basis of the current figures, on average, 247 Palestinians are being killed and are at risk of being killed each day, many of them literally blown to pieces. They include 48 mothers each day, 2 every hour, and over 117 children each day, leading UNICEF to call Israel's actions a war on children. On current rates which show no sign of abating, each day, over 3 medics, 2 teachers, more than 1 United Nations employee, and more than 1 journalist will be killed, many while at work or in what appear to be targeted attacks on their family homes or where they are sheltering. The risk of famine will increase each day. Each day, an average of 629 people will be wounded, some multiple times over, as they move from place to place, desperately seeking sanctuary. Each day, over 10 Palestinian children will have 1 or both legs amputated, many without anaesthetic. Each day, on current rates, an average of 3,900 Palestinian homes will be damaged or destroyed. More mass graves will be dug. More cemeteries will be bulldozed and bombed and corpses violently exhumed, denying even the dead any dignity or peace. Each day, ambulances, hospitals and medics will continue to be attacked and killed. The first responders who have spent 3 months without international assistance, trying to dig families out of the rubble with their bare hands, will continue to be targeted. On current figures, 1 will be killed almost every second day, sometimes in attacks launched against those attending the scene to rescue the wounded. Each day, yet more desperate people will be forced to relocate from where they are sheltering or will be bombed in places where they have been told to evacuate to. entire multi-generational families will be obliterated, and yet more Palestinian children will become WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, the terrible new acronym born out of Israel's genocidal assault on the Palestinian population in Gaza. There is an urgent need for provisional measures to prevent imminent, irreparable prejudice to the rights in issue in this case. There could not be a clearer or more compelling case. In the words of the Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, there must be an end to the decimation of Gaza and of its people.
Madam President, members of the Court, the nightmarish environment created by Hamas has been concealed by the applicant, but it is the environment in which Israel is compelled to operate. Israel is committed, as it must be, to comply with the law, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter contempt for the law. It is committed, as it must be, to demonstrate humanity, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter inhumanity. As will be presented by Council, these commitments are a matter of express government policy, military directives and procedures. They are also an expression of Israel's core values. And, as shall also be shown, they are matched by genuine measures on the ground to mitigate civilian harm under the unprecedented and excruciating conditions of warfare created by Hamas. It is plainly inconceivable, under the terms set by this very court, that a state conducting itself in this way, in these circumstances, may be said to be engaged in genocide, not even prima facie. The key component of genocide, the intention to destroy a people in whole or in part, is totally lacking. What Israel seeks by operating in Gaza is not to destroy a people, but to protect a people, its people, who are under attack on multiple fronts, and to do so in accordance with the law, even as it faces a heartless enemy determined to use that very commitment against it. As will be detailed by Council, Israel's lawful aims in Gaza have been clearly and repeatedly articulated by its Prime Minister, its Defence Minister, and all members of the War Cabinet. As the Prime Minister reiterated yet again this week, Israel is fighting Hamas terrorists, not the civilian population. Israel aims to ensure that Gaza can never again be used as a launch pad for terrorism. As the Prime Minister reaffirms, Israel seeks neither to permanently occupy Gaza or to displace its civilian population. It wants to create a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike, where both can live in peace, thrive and prosper, and where the Palestinian people have all the power to govern themselves, but not the capacity to threaten Israel. If there is a threat to that vision, if there is a humanitarian threat to the Palestinian civilians of Gaza, it stems primarily from the fact that they have lived under the control of a genocidal terrorist organization that has total disregard for their life and well-being. That organization, Hamas, and its sponsors seek to deny Israel, Palestinians, and Arab states across the region the ability to advance a common future of peace, coexistence, security, and prosperity. Israel is in a war of defense against Hamas, not against the Palestinian people, to ensure that they do not succeed. In these circumstances, there can hardly be a charge more false and more malevolent than the allegation against Israel of genocide. The applicant has regrettably engaged in a transparent attempt to abuse the Convention's compulsory jurisdiction mechanism, and in particular the provisional measures phase of proceedings, to bring under the purview of the Court matters over which, in truth, it lacks jurisdiction.
So David Shaven has been closely following the proceedings at The Hague, and he's here to talk to us about it. David, well, we just gave people a bit of a taste of what's been going on. What do you have to say to us?
It's quite a bit. The simple case is, without looking at all the arguments about Hamas, Hamas is a political organization. They have a military component. To define any member of Hamas, you can go into every town, village, school. They're all over the place. The decision by Israel was to wipe out, when they made a decision to wipe out and not target any particular military groupings, they knew they were going to violate the Genocide Convention. Without even going to all the questions of, this explosion got 30 civilians and 10 Hamas military guys, or whatever the figures are. The simple point is that the Israeli army blockaded Gaza for weeks on weeks. No food, no water. They control all the borders. There used to be over 500 trucks a day coming into of food, of supplies coming into Gaza as a normal day. It was totally eliminated, completely. There's no argument about intention to go after the whole population. Later on, the Israelis try to claim that all these nasty comments by Netanyahu and the Minister of National Security, Ben Gvir, the Defense Minister, the leaders of the Knesset, all these statements made that we have to wipe out all the population. There are no innocent people in Gaza. They try to argue those are just random comments made on the side. It's the actions on the ground prove it. That's what happened. I have trouble pronouncing the fellow's name, Timbeka Negu Kaitobi. That was the first clip you showed, where he goes through Netanyahu's order to the soldiers from Amalek about wiping everybody out. But shortly after that, the gentleman showed a video of those soldiers. Just a bizarre scene. They're singing and celebrating. They're jubilant, and they've got whole new words to whatever song they're singing. And it's what the fellow quoted, that they have to exterminate the seed of Amalek. And the other lyric is there's no innocence. Everybody is involved. Everybody in Gaza is involved. There are no innocents. And this is the song they're singing. It's like a bad movie. So the two South African representatives who preceded there are two South Africans give an overview, including the Minister of Justice, who used the quote from Dr. King that you referred to about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice. Those two spoke, and then there were 6 different presenters of different parts of the case. What you saw was the presentation about the actions on the ground, what actually occurred. Excuse me, that was not shown. That was the first presentation. The second one you saw was the intent, the argument on intent behind all those actions, unimpeachable actions. You had the confessions of intent by these people to carry those things out, that it was not an accident that people had no food and water. Later on, the woman, Lynn Nigrale, as close as I can come to this Irish name, her responsibility was to explain what further genocide is to come. The dead bodies have not arrived yet. So she went into an excellent presentation on what it meant to displace 85 to 90% of the population, to drive them out of their homes. Most of them just overnight, within hours. You mean they had nowhere to take a large part of the population right now is suffering from the cold and disease because they have no winter clothes. They were driven out back in October? A large chunk of them. The clothes are not being provided. There's no intent to provide them. So the orders, what she described was the buildup of conditions that we now face. And what we now face is 1.9 million displaced people going through a winter, dirty water, disease conditions. These camps are lucky to have one toilet for 100 or 200 people. It's the garbage piles up. It's there's no doubt about the actual conditions, and she laid out why the expectation by any medical experts, epidemic experts, is that they will have more deaths than the 24,000 already accumulated. So what I found quite touching is what she very poetically did in terms of addressing the members of the court is cited she showed a photo of a blackboard in what's now a destroyed hospital in northern Gaza. And I forget the exact words, but there's handwritten on the blackboard, for anybody who sees this after us, we did the best we could. It's in your hands now, something to that effect. And then she quoted the sections from, what's his name? The Bethlehem minister, his Christmas sermon, asking the world, where were you when the genocide was being carried out in Hamas? And that's what she asked. She presented to the court that South Africa, in that 3-hour period, has put together. They've done their part. They didn't flinch, like that doctor saying before. That doctor, by the way, died in an Israeli bombing shortly after what he wrote on the blackboard. And South Africa presents to the court that they've done their part. They heard that message. They've done their part. It's now up to the court to do their part. This is a moment in history. You can't flinch. That's what I'll say for the opening.
Well, I think what's needed is what is the strategic importance of this. Sure, it's horrific. Of course, that's all true. But it's not, in my view at least, what actually occurred. I mean, I'll just say something about this straightforwardly. I think I have to intervene at this point. What has actually occurred is the opposite, because that circumstance that you described, like it or not, I think people have to deal with this around the world. You can find that circumstance right now in Congo. You can find that circumstance right now in Sudan. You can find that circumstance right now in Libya, and would be seen as horrific, except for the way in which the policy elite has treated the continent of Africa as a whole. I mean, it's something was said about 4 out of every 5 people that face imminent starvation are in Palestine. Do we actually know that? The answer is no. That can't be known, because the situation in places like Congo and other places is never actually known in the way in which they talk about it. And I think what's important here is that what we had happen, what South Africa did, what South Africans also know, is that they've just called on the carpet the true predator, the true monster, the true source of evil, which is not Israel. Netanyahu, that's a little different. He's obviously got some relationship to Beelzebub that's privileged. It's some sort of nepotism. But when you're talking about the actual agency of this business, what we see in Ukraine with the Azov Battalion, and what we see in the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, is identical. But who runs the puppets? Who runs the puppets? I think this is something that needs to be discussed in terms of what these hearings actually did. I think you should address that, because, in fact, a lot of the world reaction, I thought it was said actually in the opening statement, there were 15 other nations that were very happy to back up South Africa. They may not have been the people that would have initiated it. So this has really done something quite a bit different. And matter of fact, I'm just reminded in saying that of the remarks that were made by Jeffrey Sachs, if I can call them up. He had a response. He was actually in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, the morning that this all broke. And what happened was he was interviewed by Judge Napolitano, Andrew Napolitano, here in the United States. And here's what he had to say about it. This is a part of what he said. He said, "This is an absolutely astounding day, an historic day. South Africa has filed an application with the International Court of Justice. This is the UN's global court in The Hague. It addresses disputes between governments." And then he says, "In this case, this is a dispute brought by South Africa, claiming that Israel is undertaking genocidal actions and with genocidal intent." That's actually why we showed those two clips, one on the actions, the other on the intent. And then it talks about the legal basis for this is that both South Africa and Israel are parties to the 1948 Genocide Convention. Notably, South Africa became a signatory to the 1948 Genocide Convention only in 1998. So for anybody who might have thought mistakenly that the apartheid regime had signed on to the 1948 Genocide Convention, no, it was done in honor of, in one sense, and in the spirit of Nelson Mandela, who made sure that was done. And so he then says, "It's stunning, amazing to watch these proceedings. South Africa filed an extremely detailed application, 84 pages, describing both the intentionality of Israel in destroying Gaza and the actions of Israel in bombing core infrastructure," so forth. He goes on. "And the combination of the statements from the prime minister and the president through the cabinet to the members of the Knesset to members of the Israeli Defense Forces is a shocking list of statements, because these are statements saying flat out that Gaza is to be destroyed." He goes on and talks about that. And he says, "No doubt these Israeli leaders would like to walk back what they said, because what they said was flat out unbelievably ugly and destructive. And I think South Africa makes a compelling case expressive of genocidal intent. So to watch this in a body of law rather than in the spin of, say, a White House briefing, or somebody just brushing this aside as John Kirby did when he said, well, this is a bunch of nonsense. The United States rejects all of this as nonsense. But to hear it spelled out methodically, hour after hour, in precise judicial proceedings is, I think, an historic day. Because Israel is being examined closely for what it has said and what it is doing. And this is, to my mind, the highest responsibility and application of the concept of international law. So I think it's a very big day. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, two main points. It's the United States. One, there was what, 500,000 or more. The United States violated the Geneva Convention flagrantly in Iraq between 2003 and 2006, minimally. Nobody took us to court. There is a court proceeding now, and that those actions eat away at populations around the world and inside the United States. Everybody knows we did it. Everybody knows we were lying, getting into it. So it's very destructive. What's happened is very healthy interventions occurred where there's going to be another genocide trial. It's scheduled for first hearing in the United States in Oakland, California, on January 26. President Biden, the Secretary of State Blinken, and the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin are the defendants. This is for genocide for, as it were, aiding and abetting Israel in what they've done, but it's also in complicity in what they've done. The organization that's filed the case on behalf of a lot of Palestinians and Jewish families here in the United States Center, what is it? The Center for Constitutional Justice. Back a few months ago in November, when the U.S. Congress was deliberating over Biden's call for $14 billion of aid to Israel, including military weaponry, they circulated a warning to all the members of Congress. This is the CCJ group, excuse me, the Center for Constitutional Justice. Quote, please take notice that should you vote in favor of that package, the Biden package for Israel, you risk facing criminal and civil liabilities for aiding and abetting genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity under international law, and may face investigation and prosecution. The issue is not simply that they did these things. Nobody hears it. Nobody paid attention to our genocide in Iraq. You know, what South Africa's done is set a new bar in the world. We're on the other side of that. I can't tell you what's going to happen on January 26th with the legal suit against President Joe Biden for genocide, for aiding it and complicity in genocide. But it's a new world because of one country standing up. Number two, the other big issue, how empire works is sort of sadistic. You know, the German population wasn't the worst population in the world throughout the 19th, 20th centuries. The Jewish population did quite well there. It was one of the best places in the world for them. What happened in terms of that genocide is you had financial conditions put on Germany. You know, I'm not going to apologize for some of the idiots in Germany who could not figure out what was going on, post a competent solution, but they played ball within that empire. And blood and soil results came out of that. And then you get victimized populations. Here's the key part of the empire. You've got a whole population that's been victimized. They're hurt. They're not thinking totally rationally. It would take economic development, a future for their children, et cetera, for them to come back to health. So empire methods are you victimize whole sections of populations. You do it over and over again. And the most efficient way to do that is to take the last victimized group and pit them against the rest of the world. Blood and soil. I was almost wiped out. I've got my plot. I will defend like a mad dog, whatever comes at me. So, you know, the Israelis can sit there and say that, oh, you have to first look at October 7th. They're the enemy. And they're components of Hamas. Hamas is a resistance organization founded in the 80s. After about 40 years of Palestinians being pushed around, I'm not for them. But they're, you know, Netanyahu was the biggest supporter of Hamas. The game was make sure there is no collaboration between populations. There's no healing between Palestinians and Israelis. There's no making the desert green, bringing in irrigation, nuclear plants, water projects. You know, that doesn't exist. So so this game that's gone on. I mean, as you saw from the Israeli spokesman, oh, here's what they did on October 7th. That divide. It's the same game. They said, here's what they did to us in World War II. It's evil in both cases. You don't stop it by becoming more evil than what just hit you. So that's
Bob,
the second major point is it's empire method.
That's good. Before we go to Bob, I want to also just bring something up and have you respond to it. It's a second portion of that Wesley Clark interview that we showed before, and this is relevant for everybody to watch because he deals with Iran, which is the next country that we are about to try to start a war with. Let's take a look.
Here's the truth, that Iran from the beginning has seen that the presence of the United States in Iraq was a threat. A blessing, because we took out Saddam Hussein and the Baathists. They couldn't handle them. We took care of it for them, but also a threat because they knew that they were next on the hit list. And so, of course, they got engaged. They lost 1 million people during the war with Iraq. And they've got a long and unprotectable, unsecurable border. So it was in their vital interest to be deeply involved inside Iraq. They tolerated our attacks on the Ba'athis. They were happy we captured Saddam Hussein, but they're building up their own network of influence, and to cement it, they occasionally give some military assistance and training and advice, either directly or indirectly, to both the insurgents and to the militias. And in that sense, it's not exactly parallel, because there has been, I believe, continuous Iranian engagement. Some of it legitimate, some of it illegitimate. I mean, you can hardly fault Iran because they're offering to do eye operations for Iraqis who need medical attention. That's not an offense that you can go to war over, perhaps, but it is an effort to gain influence. And the administration has stubbornly refused to talk with Iran about their perception, in part because they don't want to pay the price with their our U.S. domestic political base, the right-wing base, but also because they don't want to legitimate a government that they've been trying to overthrow. If you were Iran, you'd probably believe that you were mostly already at war with the United States anyway, since we've asserted that their government needs regime change.
Okay, now, apart from the rather shocking idea that giving somebody an eye operation is not an offense you can go to war over, which was actually said, if anybody was paying attention to that clip, let me just give a bit of a background so this is clear. The war between Iraq and Iran, of which Wesley Clark was speaking, was from September of 1980 till August of 1988. The United States had occupied Iran, overthrown its government in 1953, and then got kicked out, so to speak, in 1979 after a set of destabilizations that the United States and the British Empire conducted on that country. Then the next war, the war started between Iraq and Iran, which the United States helped to finance Iraq to carry out. That's one of the reasons that Donald Rumsfeld was so confident that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, because he gave Saddam Hussein various chemical and related weapons in 1983 to use against the Iranians. And of course, at the conclusion of that war, which was also the same period when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the war concluded between the two countries in 1988. Then you had a series of events, which we don't have to go through here, involving Iraq. But more to the point right now, it's clear that the Yemen adventure is aimed at Iran and creating a war between the United States, or rather that the United States initiates together with the British, who, as they remember, are there at every turn. They're there in Ukraine, they're there in Yemen, they're there around the Gaza question. They're always there. So, David, what do you think, having heard that and thinking about what you've already said here? How does this impact the present circumstance to see the face of this operation, within 24 hours of the hearings at the Hague?
I think that's the point. They could have exploded this whole thing going into Gaza. The British, I mean, and their idiots in Washington who constrained to function within their fishbowl. It was a certain amount of maturity in the Arab and Palestinian world that did not allow that scenario to play out. There's been a lot of Yemen is a trigger, not just for Iran. You start getting this going. All the work done that China has proved that they could do in terms of getting Shiite and Sunni sections of the Muslim world to work together, to not be played by the British against each other. That's exactly what's being, that can work. And that's exactly what these triggers are meant to do. Yemen is certainly, I don't doubt it's on all 7 on that list. And it goes back to what Henry Kissinger's National Security Memorandum of 200 from back in 1973, that if you're a country that still are doing things that allow your population to grow, that you have a population, then you're going to be using up resources in this world. And we've already declared we want those resources. So you having babies and managing to keep people alive in your country are a national security risk to the United States. And they named a couple of dozen, 20 countries, and I'm sure most of those are on the list. So they'll trigger you. It's not. Don't people should not think it's just triggered. Iran is the center of the has a lot of influence in the area, as Wesley Clark indicated, not just Yemen, and to torch this thing off. The British had their little maps and every little factional possibility, hostilities over decades for different rival groups in every one of the countries, and you can just trigger that. You can trigger that off. So yeah, the timing of it is. People knew from December 29th when South Africa filed their issue, and the court set the January 11th, January 11th as the date 2 days ago, that something was going to happen, and they put together this task force they had on Yemen. What was it, about a week ago? They issued their "We're not kidding. This is our last warning. Next time you do anything in Yemen, we're going to hit you." So they hit him once, and a lot of people in Congress thought, well, maybe we just lost our argument, and that Biden should come to Congress. Hope he doesn't do it again right now. It happened again. This is not an accidental thing where they expect Yemen to say, okay, we're sorry. It's an explicit trigger. It's being pulled. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not just Iran. You've got the whole instabilities which have been quieted down by the Chinese diplomacy, which can be blown up by this type of action, could have been blown up on October 12th and 13th when Israel made it clear how obnoxious they were going to be, how genocidal they were going to be in terms of how they treated the Palestinian population. So I hope that addresses your question on that.
I think it does, and it gives also a useful segue to Bob because of your reference to population war, which is one of the features of the Gaza situation, clearly, arguably, I think, Ukraine, and also the general orientation. You referenced National Security Study Memorandum 200, which was actually 74. Henry Kissinger was involved in that, George Bush and others. So what we should do here, I think we want to go to Bob because in Germany, we have a contrasting picture of an unexpected but very welcome reaction to well-known, a long train of abuses that happened there. And then suddenly 100,000 tractors appeared on the street. At least that's the way it appeared. And that suddenly entered the international stage exactly when this situation in the Hague came to prominence. So, Bob, tell us something about not only what happened, but also how you place this in the context of the international struggle against the various banking, financial, and military agencies that seem to be doing the same thing with food that they're doing with fighting these wars.
Well, the more you listen to this discussion today, the more I've shifted gears about 3 times on how to approach discussing this whole thing. But I've been in a little dialogue with Jose in terms of trying to show a video. And if that's up there, Jose, we can go to that right now. This is last March in the Netherlands. The Farmers Defense Force, which is a very unique group of farmers, they've been fighting for the farmers there. They had a big rally. They called up 5,000 tractors. They called up 100,000 people they expected. And 3 days before the event, the government said, if you have more than 2 tractors, we're going to call out the military. Well, I want to go to a brief speech that I made there at their invitation, because to show the necessity of pulling together the food producers and getting the citizens in all walks of life to understand that. If we're ready, Jose, we could take off on that. Okay, hello. Greetings from the farmers and ranchers in the United States. I am Bob Baker from a family farm in Iowa. I salute you. I consider this the highest honor humanity could have, to have this kind of a group step forward and fight for food and food producers. I bring special support from cattlemen in the American West, from the RCAF organization in Montana and other states, from the Kansas Cattlemen's Association, the National Dairy Producers Association, members of the National Farmers Union, and from the Schiller Institute internationally. Let this be the beginning for us to join forces to defeat the common enemy. It is the financial complex in London, Wall Street, and Amsterdam. That demands drastic cuts in farming and food. This is depopulation. It's not science. It is evil. You are on the front lines, but it's the same fight for us all. We must trash the green lies that say chemistry, machinery, food, and power are bad for the earth. This is a fraud. In South Dakota, wolves attack our sheep because the government now protects the wolves. For biodiversity, Western lands are being banned from livestock grazing because the government demands 30% of the land be banned from agriculture by 2030. The real cause of the crisis is the financial complex, creating energy poverty, food poverty, and life poverty. They lie and they say they blame Russia, China, and war. It's all a fraud. They are rip-offs. They are financial rip-offs. Millions are in the streets now in Europe, France, Germany, Italy, Britain. I was at a Washington, D.C. rally in the February. Over 3,000 people showed up. Meantime, millions around the world are starving for lack of food. We must put in place a new system for production. We stand ready to work together with you to get the tractors rolling in the USA and to link up to the farmers in India, Africa, South America, and everywhere. Thank you for taking the point. We stand with you side by side.
Thank you very much.
So, as you can hear, there was quite a reaction from the crowd there, especially when we started discussing the financial big wheels and their policy that's behind the scenes on this process. Now, in Germany, as we've heard discussed several times today, it's quite an impressive thing. And we've got a little footage. Maybe some people have seen some of this, maybe people haven't. But when you think about 100,000 tractors moving around the communities of a nation like Germany, these are not small tractors. This is massive machinery. You figure a tractor's 5 to 10 ton apiece, 100,000. You put some pencil to that, and you feel the steel, the technology, the kinds of things that are at stake if you don't have food. Now, I think we got another one ready to go. Let's see what we have here on the German farmers.
Update Eckernförde, 12.01. Sammelpunkt vor der Sternfahrt nach Kiel. In 10 Minuten geht's los.
So if you look at that, you can see it would take a very good piece of logistic guidance to get all those tractors lined up like they were there sitting. We have another one. Let's see number 2. Now, that takes a lot of work, but it also takes tremendous dedication. So if you see with the people with a frame of mind as a community and a nation able to pull together like that, to unify, that's what gave us in the United States a republic. That was what the founding fathers took on, and they had that kind of fearless capability of making it work. Now, I want to jump to another aspect of this, because we can discuss that in Germany they've had thousands of tractors going through city after city after city. They have tractors lined up for miles. In one place, it's 20 kilometers in many places. And they were organized. They set tractors out ahead to block off the entranceways so that they could streamline going through the country without causing big backups. But they also, the reports were from the especially the news, and they did surveys that 70 to 80% of the population that was backed up in traffic jams, they were with the farmers. They were saying, we're with them. We don't care. Now that is a massive shift in terms of what you could build on this. Now, the next thing I want to put up is a diagram that Lyndon LaRouche discusses. He calls it the triple curve. And the triple curve, and here we have the current one on the left, and what we'd like to see if we get the policy that we're talking about in the future. Now, what I want to do, since we've been having a lot of discussion about genocide and how it functions to slowly hurt the civilian people and the population in general, we know that these financial elite that we have defined better than about anybody, they have definitely a long-range plan to reduce the population of the world. Now, if you put that back up, that triple curve, I'm going to discuss a little bit on that. And if you go back there about where it started, let's say that's about 1971. Now, David earlier mentioned that the Nixon released this report about how there was too many people in the world eating up the resources. That was about 74, 73. In 71, President Nixon was pushed by the London bankers in Wall Street to unhook the dollar from a fixed exchange rate, and he started floated our dollar. Now, you can see real fast how much that helped us, because as you floated the dollar, he unhooked our currency from physical production and hooked it up to speculation. And the speculation is a form of genocide if you look at what it does to the living standards of the people. So let's look at that left graph. If you see the blue line, you notice that's physical production. And over time, when you start investing more and more money in speculation, you put less and less into physical. And what happens, you start losing people like farmers, food producers, skilled labor, people that build machinery. Now, if you look at the yellow line, that's what happens when you can legally, at your bank, borrow money for speculation. So you can look at the price of farmland. And if you think back at the farm crisis in the U.S. back in the early 1980s and late 70s, the land prices were jumping 25 to 30% a year. And boom, all of a sudden, when they got to 20% interest rates, land prices crashed 60 some percent in about a year and a half. And farmers went broke all over the place. Banks went down. And we started to see the reconsolidation of agriculture into bigger and bigger operations because there wasn't enough profitability to support a family. So that meant now we have most of the income coming into the farm households of the United States are off-farm income, because we have about 2 million farmers in the United States, but 10% of those farmers are producing 90% of the food. And that means 90% of the farmers are producing 10%. And you got 50% of the farmers in the U.S. producing 1%. That means they're part-time farmers. So the point is under this scenario of policy, we're going to see more consolidation and then we see things like when COVID hit, all of a sudden you had millions of head of livestock being slaughtered because they couldn't put them through the consolidated meat packers. Now, I'm going to jump over to the graph on the right. Now, that's what we need. You see the blue lines going up. That's physical production. That means more family farms, more carpenters, more steel men, more industrial building. That means that there's a future for the families, but that also means that young people are getting trained in the science of physical production rather than the science, so-called science, of speculation, where you make tons of money doing absolutely nothing productive except trying to figure out how you're going to make money without producing anything. So I want to move on to the one with the red barn and show people. Now, this is what you might call the American system of economics. So rather than thinking about how we're going to try and help the farmers survive, let's think about creating new farms, like 1 million of them. Let's do what Lincoln did. He set in motion the Homestead Act of 1862. Let's set in motion the Homestead Act of the 21st century. But this Homestead Act is not just building another 1 million farmers using the highest states of technology. They don't have to be super big. They could be super efficient, but the idea is to lay a groundwork for a rural community and cities and rural food production that's going to be producing the highest quality food, educating people, having communities all across the nation, and also having the states of technology that we see in other parts of the world, like the maglev train. You know, China's got 10,000 kilometers of that. The U.S. has 0. and it was invented in Pittsburgh. You see, we have a space program that we should just be all way ahead of where we're at. We watched Germany shut down all of their nuclear power plants, and now we're in the process of following that. And there is a bigger need than ever to get fusion power so that we could have unlimited energy. But you see, that is tied in to those dynamics we just went through with the triple curve and how big international financial institutions, London bankers, Wall Street bankers, Amsterdam. Remember, there was a thing called the Anglo-Dutch Empire, and there was the British East India Company. Now, these were all models of the initial global corporations that we have set in motion today. And today we have a handful of people like BlackRock and big investor types like that that are the biggest investors in these global corporations, and they're in the military, financial, industrial complex, and they're in the agriculture, financial, industrial complex. So I wanted to just mention that cross section of what we got, and I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Dennis.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bob. You actually raised several things, and there's also a couple of questions which have come in. But I wanted to ask you to speak about something, because you talked about the 1 million farmers, but then you also were segueing into you referenced a discussion in terms of space, and you had an idea about the space farmer. I wanted you to say something about that, because Jose, who's in the background there, has had that proposal from, I think, 2017. I think was when Jose first talked about this idea of a space CCC. He's talking about what should be done with the urban centers of the United States. But you also have a view of the rural section. So if you could say something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the around the cities in particular is where, that's where we ought to be growing a lot of food. I mean, we used to. Today, it's super consolidated into these big corporate structures. But when you get into the idea of astronaut farming, I mean, you're talking about putting together the science of our GPS system, the satellites we've got going around that can detect, they can take infrared photos of all the crops. They can show you exactly in a field where the weed infestation is the heaviest, where it's dry, where there's low moisture or too much moisture, or those types of things. Or even they can, by the infrared signature on the plant, they can tell if it needs a certain kind of fertilizer or more or less and that kind of thing. That's just one of the areas of the astronaut farmer. But you put in the technology like they've done in the combines, for instance, and you can measure the field as you harvest it. As you're going across a field of corn or wheat, the computerized technology in that combine can tell you what the yield is per foot. It can record that data, and it can tell you various things about the moisture of the grain, the test weight of the grain, the quality of it. And so that can be recorded. And then when you plan your planting in the next spring, then you can pull up that data and you can calculate, well, okay, I see the computer tells me this little area over here on my field is low on nitrogen or potash or phosphate or some micronutrient. And so we should put a little more there, but we don't need to put it over the whole field. Well, now you start pinpointing things like that throughout the field. Now they have big trucks that can apply the fertilizer, And they used to just mix it all up in one big batch. Now they mix it, it's all separate. And so you can plug in that data, that combine recorded about where the most production was, and the infrared satellites figured out where the nutrients were needed. And as you drive through the field applying your fertilizer for the next year, it will mix the fertilizer. It will put heavier applications in some areas, lighter applications, increase the nitrogen, decrease the potash. It can mix all this while it goes through the field. And that's just in the planning end. Now, when you get in the processing end, the speed at which you can, evaluate and package and sort the various types of food, it's just beautiful. And anyway, that's just one area.
Okay, now there's several things going on at once. Let me just say one thing, because there's been a couple of questions that came in. One is because of, well, actually, let me see if I can summarize, put them together. The idea is that Gaza, we've talked about an oasis plan for Southwest Asia, and we've talked about the problem of water, both for Gaza specifically, this idea about their flooding the tunnels with salt water, and then this would make it, this would leach into or seep into the regular groundwater that people drink. So people, what's being asked is that how does what you're talking about, how does the Oasis plan that we've written about in one sense, and how does what you're talking about, do these things come together in some form? Because with people having mobilized in the streets of Germany, maybe there are places that people can mobilize, farmers can mobilize, in other words, be that in the United States or Spain. It's sort of I'll put it like that, okay? It's sort of a combination of things have come in. I'm trying to put them together.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can see like in Germany, the city people. I mean, they're there. So the big process is to pull people together and not let the mass media and the big bank institutions and the money boys separate people and say, well, the farmers are getting subsidies and the people can't find enough to eat. No, we ought to implement some laws. We got laws on the books to bust up monopolies. We ought to bust up these big packing plants and monopolies that are producing controlling things. I mean, like things of 70 and 80, close to 90% controlled by 3 or 4 big companies. So if you start thinking about that, now you're pulling people together. So now we're thinking like a nation. And the idea is you could see all kinds of technology. It's already being used where food could be grown, in like in the Netherlands. They have a tremendous amount of food grown under cover, under roof, in very tall things that they call it vertical growing. But yeah, so you take the Oasis plan. Now you got water. You start putting that together. That's absolutely vital. But now you start putting together the sophistication of the weather, the analysis of that. You start putting together the sophistication of the plant genetics, and how you start to mold them and mix them, especially with the technology. I mean, the technology of farmers and machinery is just unbelievable how precise this stuff has become. And then, you think, well, gosh, what's that farmer know about, he just drives a tractor back and forth. Well, not really, because a lot of those tractors now are driving themselves back and forth, and the farmer's sitting in there and he's looking at 3 or 4 computer screens and all kinds of stuff while he's managing, many other things. So this is what we could see all over the world, except there's one thing that stops it. We got a policy run by some very rich old oligarch families that run the big banks of the world, and they want to reduce the world population, drastically reduce it. And once you get things consolidated into global monopolies, you can just flip a switch and you can shut all kinds of stuff down, especially when you control the media. That's why what we've got and what LaRouche set up in our intelligence news service and people on the ground is so important.
Okay, I think we're going to put Jose in, who has something he wants to say to you, Bob, about what you're talking about. But before we go, keep him right there, right? And before we go to him, let me just indicate to David that there is a question from Steve, and it just says, from 1980 to 88, the U.S. backed Iraq the war. I'm giving the question now, but I actually want Jose to stay up because we're going to go to him. So I want David to know about it so he can think about it. From 1980 to 88, the U.S. backed Iraq against Iran, while funds from the Iran-Contra network financed and supplied Iran. Both sides, over 1 million people died. Can you speak more to the role of the U.S. and U.K. in Iran over the past 70 years, from the Shah-backed overthrow of from the CIA-backed overthrow of the Shah, and its relevance today in provoking a wider regional war in the Middle East? Okay, that's the question that they want you to take up. So I wanted you to know the question before we go to this discussion, so you can think about it. So, Jose, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Bob. I just wanted to take a minute here to respond to you and really pick up the idea of the space CCC, and also this idea of the space farmer. I'm a city boy. I was born in the Bronx, and I think what connects us all, though, is food. But even beyond the food is the technology. I had proposed this idea of a space CCC. So the CCC part stands for Civilian Conservation, or excuse me, Civilian Construction Corps. And the idea of this is that you have neighborhoods that are run down, like the South Bronx, that were once industrial areas, and you have big unemployment in the youth population, 18 to 26. On top of that, you have people who are in the mentorship age, right? People who might be retired union workers or laborers or specialists, right? Who don't have any more productive work. Maybe they've taken up some kind of vocational training role. And what you do is you put these two generations together in an emergency crash program, and you say, okay, listen, we have an influx of immigrants. We have an influx of homelessness. We have an influx of disease. What we're going to do is, because we need labor and we need people who are skilled, we are going to take the retired people who are actually educated and skilled in this, and they're going to teach the people who are unemployed, 18 to 26. Doesn't matter their background, college educated, not college educated, high school dropout, high school graduate, delinquent, whatever it is, and say, okay, you're going to go away and you're going to learn the skills that you need to actually build up, not even just what your neighborhood needs, but the skills of engineering, of carpentry, of whatever is required to build modern hospitals, schools, and high-speed rail. And you take these skills that they learn and export it city to city, possibly even building new cities. And then we get into this idea of the nuplexes, which is an even more advanced idea. But I'm talking about where we actually start. And this idea came out of the here in the Bronx for two reasons. One is because Gouverneur Morris here in the South Bronx, this area is called Morrisania, and it's named after Gouverneur Morris, the man who penned the Constitution. So he actually was the one who wrote it down. And I just thought, what better way to actually change and redefine what the Bronx is? Because if you go around the world, as I did in Europe, and you talk about the Bronx, people know about the Bronx. They might not know a whole lot about New York City. Maybe they know a little bit about Brooklyn, but people around the world know the Bronx, and it's not for good reasons. But if you redefine it, having a space CCC here in the Bronx, you can actually fix an entire generation, and you can just reverse course on the United States. And so before I continue to ramble on here, I'll stop there and just, if you have any response, Bob.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you what, hearing what you just said makes me want to live another 50 years, because this is important. Because, see, when we, this idea of a million new family farms, that's just sort of a metaphor. It means a million new family farms, but also it's a geometry of economic development. It means we got to get the financial system put in order, and then we got to bust up these monopolies so they're not looting the general public and the producer at the same time. So you can see beautiful things in wherever you wanted to set this up, because there's it's not just growing grain crops, it's growing vegetables, it's growing grapes, citrus, everything. So the idea that we think about with a million new family farms is we need a government program. And in this situation, in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to have about 65% of the current farmers retire. And most of them do not have an heir coming back to farm. So what's waiting to move in? Well, you got investor money already set up to go and buy farmland. You can just buy $100 worth, pool all the money, and you can pay the price as high as you want. Just keep moving the money in. But that doesn't mean it's going to be farmed right. So you find qualified younger people that want to farm. And the older farmer, with his experience, he's got a unique kind of experience. And the younger farmer would have a unique kind of experience, especially in the area of understanding high tech and the computers and all that, which is very important now with agriculture. But so you set in motion a process where these can team up. The older farmer already has his farm. The younger farmer gets a credit line to buy the machinery, furnish the labor, but they both end up selling their products with a special pricing system, which is parity-oriented pricing. Now, just to give you an example of how much, now what's that going to do? That's going to create such a tremendous amount of income back into the rural communities, and then it multiplies it. What they've done many studies that whatever income comes into agriculture, it is multiplied 8 to 10 times back, because it gets spent over and over and over, because people are buying physical goods, machinery, and things they need to fix. That's jobs, and that means they got to educate their kids and have health care, all that kind of thing. But when you have it like it is today, where a handful of big monopolies are making unprecedented amounts of money off the retail food in the grocery store, and the farmers are being squeezed until there's hardly any farmers yet left to produce. And they say, well, this is the wave of the future, because you got to be big and because that's the only way you can be efficient. Well, there's no end to it under this system, the way it's set up, because it's like the old colonial system, where there is it's just another form of control by a handful of very rich people. So with that kind of that's just an example of, we have government programs that Lincoln settled the whole Midwest, with people going out there. He settled it, built railroads. Let's build some new railroads across the nation, and do all this kind of thing. Let's have a whole program to set up, like he put in land grant college system, healthcare, etc., and even put in a new bank and put in a new currency. So you see, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. That's the LaRouche policy. but in the cities, it can be done very fast. And I am totally convinced this whole idea of 1 million new family farms will find its biggest support from the cities. And that is all we got to do is get the programs going.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so David, I'm going to come back to that question. There is another matter which we will take up after that of a breaking story concerning the death of Gonzalo Lira, the journalist. We'll come to that story after we hear from you.
Yeah, I put something in on our briefing on Lira this morning. Look, Mossadegh was a fine fellow to work with in Iran back in 1953. There's some Roosevelt himself had a program for Iran back in 1944-45. Very similar to what we did in Afghanistan next door with the TVA type project for the rivers there. There's nothing complicated about that in a certain sense, any more complicated than what Bob's explaining. Human mind can take these programs and pursue policies where the population gets happier year by year. What happened with the British, with Roosevelt's death, you had a certain amount of disorientation in the United States, accepting whether they're going to accept this idiot Truman, this pedestrian fellow. And in the CIA, you had some decent people from the old OSS who knew what the importance of gathering intelligence, but then you had others who were a little bit too excited about the cleverness of the British intelligence. And so the whole overthrow of Mossadegh, the muscle way of extracting profits by exploiting raw materials out of every underdeveloped country took hold in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was not hard to make an anti-American image. So, the Khomeini revolution that overthrew the Shah was put in back in 53 when they illegitimately overthrew Mossadegh. By the hostility, the resentment builds up, the poverty builds up, and the gap between rich and poor, especially between the Shah and the general population, builds up. You had the British working with these ideologies within every religion, Christianity, Jewish, Islam, and it's basically we're little bitty poor victims. And this happened. I'm sort of giving a crude, rude, short version of how this is called Muslim fundamentalism, but like Jewish or Christian fundamentalism, it's not the part of a religion. It's part of a British empire. Says that there's only so much to go around. God is a bad God. He's torturing us. We don't have anything real we're supposed to be doing here on planet Earth, except fighting against our neighbors for ourselves. And if we have if we're lucky, we have a deal with God. When we leave this miserable Earth, we can go someplace where we'll be happier. Our punishment will be over. So that revolution to organize the mass population, not around the clear beneficial programs for Iran, but in 79 to do this version with this fundamentalism, set the control of Iran as ostensibly anti-American. British loved it. They loved it when we were doing a stupid version of capitalism, which wasn't capitalism, it was just ripping off countries. They loved it when you get native populations to constrain themselves within the same limited economic projects. I'm not saying that's how everything happened in Iran ever since then, but that moved forward in 2001 when you have Islamic fundamentalism. Lyndon LaRouche in January of 2001 testified that George Bush, the fact that he was becoming the president, wasn't a matter of being pro-Democrat or Republican or anything else, or problems with George Bush's daddies, which were real. The issue was he was incapable of dealing with the complexities of the world, and he wasn't going to solve the economic problems, and there was going to be an engineered crisis to get a crisis management government, and that's what happened in September 11, 2001. and his movement, his organization, was out in front of the White House and other locations in Washington, D.C. on August 24th, 3 weeks earlier, saying that Washington, D.C. was going to be hit with an act of terrorism. We didn't know a lot of the other details, meaning it's predictable, it's forecastable, and sometimes it becomes almost predictable in terms of a small range of time. How the progress of a long active disease comes to a climax. So we've been living under that crisis management government for 2001. Most of the Western world has. The LaRouche's intervention, in particular in the 1990s, and with a certain Confucius heritage in China coming to the fore, they grabbed onto this, what now is the Belt and Road Project. That it's in the benefit of countries to not beggar their neighbors, but to figure out projects to upraise and develop their neighbors. Not complicated. And credit institutions can be designed to accommodate that. You know, if the dog is wagging the tail and it's not the other way around, where the financial boys are the tail wagging everything else. So they have a crude version just going up to present. That intervention by China over the last year, which has resulted over 2023 in pretty much ending the British Empire's easy way to manage things, of having Sunni and Shia factions of the Islamic world pitted against each other always, and never looking at their real problems. The world becomes very clear when you can realize, yeah, these other people, I have problems with it, but what's the basis of, is there a basis for working with them? The old thing about labor and management, labor can complain that the management is screwing them. I don't have enough to feed my family. I'm working 20 hours to do it, 20 hours a day to do it. But at a certain point, that's victims. They've got to figure out, am I a human being? Can I figure out a policy that works for me, that works for my neighbor, works for labor, works for management, works for developed countries, works for underdeveloped countries? And that's what's been on the table. So there's a solution out of this mess right now. It's not simply, we need to know how the British Empire runs these vicious operations. But they've been doing that for a while. And what happened, there's a way to get ahead of what your enemy's doing. We don't always have to sit there and say, oh, they killed Kennedy, they overthrew Mossadegh, blah, blah. They are identifiable. Bob's been referring to that. What we put out in this Swords into Plowshares program is real. It gets more and more attention from the global South because they've learned on their own the hard way. They were lied to. It wasn't the commies versus the capitalist. You know, it's a matter of the American system that Bob's been describing against the British system of how to manipulate. And the breaking point comes when people take the shackles off their head. And I'll end it by saying, on the last 48 hours, maybe 60 hours now, we had a remarkable dramatic event in The Hague, where the country of South Africa, for knowable reasons I won't go into now, involving Mandela and what happened in the 1990s, did something not predictable by the British Empire. It did something like the American Revolution was not predictable by the British Empire. And it worked. And they put on a presentation which gives every person, and certainly every country, an opportunity to say, oh, I can take those shackles off my head. What was hurting me so much? And when the cat's out of the bag, yeah, of course they're going to do some ugly things. Joe Biden is ridiculous. He can be manipulated by breathing in his direction. And this is the danger point we're in. But people should both recognize the danger and then go like bloody hell on the solution.
Okay, very good. Let's go now to this issue of Gonzalo Lira. We got a question about it. And the question came from, well, it's called Art Makes a Scene. But the question was, what does the LaRouche organization think about the murder of Gonzalo Lira? That's the way that it was put. Let me read something from the Helsinki Times, and then David, who covered this earlier today, can say something. Gonzalo Lira, a Chilean-American war commentator known for his critical view of Zelensky and his regime and Russia-Ukraine conflict, passed away on January 11th, 2024, in a hospital in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Lira's death followed an 8-month imprisonment on charges of, quote, justifying Russia's military actions in Ukraine. This sparked international controversy and raised questions about freedom of speech and human rights during wartime. It says Lira gained notoriety in 2022 as a vocal critic of what he perceived as increasing authoritarianism in Ukraine. Lira saw the conflict as a proxy war waged by the United States against Russia and criticized the loss of life for a futile and unwinnable war. His arrest in May of 2023 under the charges of, quote, production and dissemination of materials justifying Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine, end quote, was a turning point. It not only highlighted the complexities of wartime free speech, but also catalyzed opposition movements against U.S. funding for the conflict. High-profile figures like tech mogul Elon Musk and Fox News host Tucker Carlson call for his release, bringing global attention to his case. Now, I just want to go to a few remarks by his father. It says that the father, it says, documents and emails revealed attempts by Gonzalo Lira Sr. to alert the embassy, the United States Embassy, about his son's critical condition and the lack of transparency from Ukrainian authorities, because remember, he's an American citizen. Quote, I cannot accept the way my son has died. He was tortured, extorted, incommunicado for 8 months and 11 days, and the U.S. Embassy did nothing to help my son, Lira Sr. stated in an email announcing the news. Quote, the responsibility of this tragedy is with the dictator Zelensky, with the concurrence of a senile American president, Joe Biden. My pain is unbearable. The world must know what is going on in Ukraine with that inhuman dictator Zelensky. And then it just says that there was a final note from Lira describing his health ordeal, including double pneumonia, pneumothorax, and severe edema. The letter, believed to be his last written correspondence, detailed the neglect he faced in prison. That's what it has. So, David, you covered this earlier, you stated. So what's your view of what this is about? And let me also ask about its relationship potentially to the whole Ukrainian list of journalists and other prominent individuals, including people like LaRouche.
Yeah, well, that's a very salient point, because it's sort of a miracle he's been alive this long. There's been a string of Ukrainian journalists and public figures who've, since 2014, have been victimized by the Maratvarets hit list, by the security services of Ukraine. We can pick up more on that, but the Lira was Gonzalo Lira was he was 55 when he died. It's fair to say that we don't know that. What we know is that on January 4th, he got a handwritten letter to his sister, which described his treatment over the last 6 months, and that had been. Let me back up. So on May 1st, he was arrested for what you said he was arrested for. He had put out on social media videos and other things. He thought in particular that the key thing that he was arrested for was a history of how Ukraine provoked this war, the history of not following the Minsk and other things, the Minsk Accords. He was a American citizen born in Chile, family in both countries, mother and father. He'd moved to Ukraine in 2010, but he still was an American citizen. He married there. He lived in that Kharkiv area. He'd actually been arrested a year earlier in 2021. In May, he was released. It was a sort of a warning thing. He was rearrested in April. He was investigated in April last year. May 1st, they charged him for what you say they charged him for just describing things. You're basically a Russian agent. He got temporary release in late July, and there was a whole series people can see on the internet of about 25 consecutive text in one day or evening, where he's basically describing that he's trying to get the hell out of Ukraine, but the authorities are on his tail, and if they don't hear from him again, assume they're going to kill him. There wasn't anything heard from him after that until this January 4th note to his sister saying, I've had pneumonia, I've had a punctured, a broken rib, and problems with his lungs. He's not sure whether the broken rib created this, but the authorities would not recognize that he had any severe pneumonia problems or lung problems until December 22nd. At that point, they scheduled him for a surgery. He says in January 4th, I'm going into surgery. It's not clear what the surgery is about. It's not clear when he died between January 4th and January 11th. It was confirmed by the State Department yesterday. Yesterday that the 11th or 12th that he was dead. So that's that part of it. He was a consistent, uncontrollable teller of truth about what was going on in his country. He loved Ukraine. He hated what was being done in Ukraine. So he said Victoria Nuland, he named her as the person who kept the State Department from acting on his behalf for his safety. Back in August, when it was brought up to the State Department that he had been rearrested trying to escape out of Ukraine to go to Hungary, I believe, on a motorcycle. The State Department just showed their cavalier disregard. What they said with this pro forma, well, in these cases like this, we don't like to say anything. We want to preserve the sanctity of the individual. What does it mean in terms of what you're bringing up, Dennis? Very few Ukrainians or Ukraine. In this case, it's an American citizen in Ukraine that this is being applied to. What happened in Ukraine back in May, June, July of 2021, yeah, I have that correct, is that the Office of the President, Yermak, they had this National Security and Defense Committee, which is council like our NSC. And they set up a subcommittee to target individuals that needed to be dealt with. Hague LaRouche was one of the biggest names put on that list. The thing about that list was, as opposed to the Muratveritz hit list from 2014 onwards, those were Ukrainians that being put on that hit list. The thing about the NSD's list was the CCD, Center for Countering Disinformation, I believe it's called, is that they were naming individuals outside of Ukraine. That meaning the implication was they were going to hit them, and this happened in the case of Dugina within a couple of months. Daria Dugina. And so they've got the capability to do this. It's unmistakable. We don't know, in fact, exactly what Lira died of, but he was kept under pretty repressive conditions. He suffered his rib injury in prison, and the reference in his letter to torture, his description on January 4th about what he'd undergone is certainly coherent, and the actions of the State Department in benign neglect is quite clear. It's a filthy story. Most of his supporters over the last couple of years have wondered how he lasted this long and wasn't executed before now.
All right, so I'm going to make a comment about that at the end. We're at the end pretty much. Let me just ask at this point, Bob, if there's anything that you'd like to say in closing remarks, either in observations of anything that's come before, observations around the South Africa matter or the German matter, or anything else that you haven't yet had a chance to comment.
Yeah, I think we have a graphic that sort of sums up some of my thoughts determining the final phase and why we've got to act now. It's actually it's one a little different one if it's available there, but there you go. This is put together because as Mr. LaRouche's triple curve, it the directionality of it, it's all going in the same direction. Eventually, it all collapses, and now you're seeing it. You're seeing, the markets. You're seeing all the various things they want to make you think is measurements of wealth, but they aren't. And so now they're all talking about hyperinflation, talking about, will we raise the interest rates or lower the interest rates? But at the same time, we see a war in Ukraine. We see a war in the Middle East. We see, if you go and analyze it, there's many wars going on, and they just keep going and getting triggered from the root is the old financial families of the old empire families, and they have a goal, and that is to reduce the population. That means they're going to dumb it down. They're going to get people to sit on the bleachers and just watch everything they can. But there is a wake-up time, and I think what we're seeing now with what South Africa has done at the court, and what we're seeing, just the average citizens waking up. What we're seeing, what we're discussing with food. Food's a big deal. You see it with the German farmers, the Netherlands farmers, the French farmers. I mean, it's a big deal. So I just sort of sum it up and tell people, our nation and nobody thought we'd win the American Revolution. They tried to overthrow our country with the Civil War. They tried to do it again with World War I and II. And people, including our founding fathers, our Lincoln with his economics people, Roosevelt brought in the American system type approach, Kennedy, and that rapidly can turn things around. Now we got something else coming in. It's called BRICS on an international scale. And let me tell you, they're not putting up with this crazy policy of hyperinflated currency. So I think, like I've been saying, makes me want to live another 50 years because this is worth living for.
David?
I love that. So people need to master what Bob's talking about, and the swords into plowshares, and don't do it in a dutiful fashion. I want to leave people just with the responsibility every day to become a poet, legislator. The circumstances are ripe for it. And every day you have to figure out how you're more powerful than this desperate London and New York financial community and their idiots in London and Washington. And I'll just to underline one example of that poetry, I'm just to go back to what I opened up with. Excuse me for reading it, but the ending of the testimony of the lawyer on Thursday morning, was her name Lynn Nigurale, was she showed the white photo. There were many graphics in her display. She showed one. It was a photo of a whiteboard at a hospital where you had all the places marked for who's going to be worked on surgery next. Everybody has seen these things when you use these sort of whiteboards, but there's nothing there. There's nobody getting surgery anymore. What's happening is just a hand scrawled message. The whiteboard is wiped clean of no longer possible surgical cases, leaving only a handwritten message by a doctor without border. It read, "Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Remember us." She explained that the author, Dr. Mahmoud Abela Jailed, died when Israel bombed the hospital, November 21st, a couple of days shortly thereafter. And she quoted the Christmas message of Bethlehem's Reverend Munther Isaac. "Gaza, as we know it, no longer exists. This is an annihilation. This is a genocide. No apologies will be accepted after the genocide. What has been done has been done." Then he addressed Christians and the world community. "I want you to look in the mirror and ask, where was I when Gaza was going through a genocide?" Then she turned to the judges and said, "South Africa is here before this court. It has done what it could. It is doing what it can by initiating these proceedings. We call upon this honorable court to do what is in its power to do. Gaza's hopes, including for their very survival, are now vested in this court." Now, think about it. They had all that evidence from the tragedies of the last 3 months. And quite frankly, that's just not going to do it. People have to get on top of that, not from the standpoint of the victim, but from the standpoint of, that Christmas, what's a Christmas message? If you're serious about it, it's that Jesus gave the world new hope. What's the message of that doctor? They've done all they could. He probably doesn't regret that. He calls upon other people to pick up the sword, so to speak. So anyhow, that's we put out a daily report. It's not just to be in touch with the smart guys, and maybe appreciate certain moral tinge to it. People are totally capable of becoming poet legislators, and that's really the best starting point. I'll add,
Right.
We got 2 weeks till Oakland has that case. I don't see why we don't have mass rallies in the United States on the genocide treaty applied to Joe Biden.
All right, David Shaven, Bob Baker, I want to thank you for being with us today, and I want to thank everybody for listening to our program, and hopefully you've been moved by it. I have a few things to say since this is Martin Luther King weekend. We might call this, "Will the real Martin Luther King movement to stop world war please stand up?" It's a nonviolence or non-existence choice, as King said. King was inspired by a lot of people. Of course, he was a minister. And in his book, Strength to Love, he has a sermon which takes a quote from Paul: "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by renewing your mind." And that is the kind of advice that people need to take by plunging into the center of the South African hearings presentation. 84 pages, but 3 hours of very tightly argued and relentless presentation of the truth. And that truth means that everyone in the United States and everyone in Western Europe has to realign themselves with the ideals they said or say they represent. If you say you are a Christian, then you have to realign yourself with that. If you say you are a human being who believes in truth and justice, you have to realign yourself, because the day has come when you have to speak on behalf of history. When Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in 1961, partially on orders of the Central Intelligence Agency, but multiple intelligence agencies, something that John Kennedy wished to prevent, but was unable to do that as he came into office. Lumumba was assassinated just before Kennedy became president. He said in the final communication to his family, "The day will come when history will speak, but It will not be the history which will be taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington. It will be the history which will be taught in the countries which have won freedom from colonialism and its puppets. Africa will write its own history, and in both North and South, it will be a history of glory and dignity. Do not weep for me. I know that my tormented country will be able to defend its freedom and independence. Long live the Congo. And it's important to think, I think, about that in the context of King's final remarks, at least in the speech called often the mountaintop speech. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I just want to do God's will. And he has allowed me to go up to the top of the mountain, and I have seen the promised land. I mean, I get there with you, but we as a people will see the promised land. So I'm not worried tonight. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. King had said somewhat earlier, it was a famous statement that he had made, you may be 38 years old as I happen to be, and one day some great opportunity stands before you and calls you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause, and you refuse to do it because you are afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you will lose your job, or you are afraid that you will be criticized, or that you will lose your popularity, or you're afraid that somebody will stab you or shoot at you or bomb your house. So you refuse to take a stand. Well, you may go on and live until you are 90, but you're just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit. And I think it's important to recognize that from about April 4th of 1967 to April 4th of 1968, King lived a 1-year Gethsemane, a 1-year wrestling with conscience, but a wrestling with conscience which was his freedom. This is what the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the cost of discipleship. It's what had been referenced by Ray McGovern a few weeks ago in a letter that Albert Camus, the writer, had written to the Vatican, in which he talked about the problem of having to speak up and pay up. A little crude, perhaps, but what he meant was very simple. You have to be willing to pay the price of freedom. Malcolm X said the price of freedom is death. Well, the price of freedom actually may not be death, but it certainly is that one must have a conscience. The price of freedom is being free. All are not prepared to pay that. Matter of fact, a whole lot of people generally avoid that. Back last year on May 3rd, on a day which was dedicated worldwide to the freedom of speech, thought, and the freedom of journalist Julian Assange, Helga LaRouche issued a statement which was called "The Freedom of the Press and Freedom of Julian Assange are identical." And she concluded that statement, the heads of state who assemble, this was a particular thing, the head of states who assembled this weekend for the coronation of King Charles can prove their commitment to freedom and democracy by congratulating the newly crowned king for making his first act the freedom of Julian Assange. Well, of course, she stated that because she knew that the King of England would not do that, because when you see what you see in Gaza, and when you see what you're seeing in Afghanistan, and when you see what you're seeing right now in Congo, and when you see what you're seeing in the destruction of the nation of Libya, and when you see what you are seeing in the attacks on nations like Syria, when you see what you see in the actual proxy war in Ukraine and Russia, you are seeing the face of true evil. And in that face, in that evil will not relent, and it will not free Julian Assange. What happened with respect to the Lira case is that Lira stood up for freedom. He paid the price for doing that. When people wish people not to pay those prices in enough numbers, then they won't pay those prices. People say, oh, well, look at what King did, and he died, and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and this one and that one. But they never say, had I acted, that would not have occurred. Now we see in the case of Gaza, this is happening now to thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and soon we will be in the millions, as happened in the Second World War and as happened to the Jewish people, over 6 million of whom were exterminated in various ways. But actually, that who quibbles about it? That's how many or more people of Jewish descent, and then 100 million people altogether in the total war in battle and non-battle circumstances. What do we have to do to change ourselves so that we might stand with those who have a conception of their own immortality? A final story I'd like to give from, this is just from Martin Luther King, may help to illustrate. He writes, on a cool Saturday afternoon in January 1954, I set out to drive from Atlanta, Georgia to Montgomery, Alabama. The Metropolitan Opera was on the radio with a performance of one of my favorite operas, Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. So, with the beauty of the countryside, the inspiration of Donizetti's inimitable music, and the splendor of the skies, the usual monotony that accompanies a relatively long drive, especially when one is alone, was dispelled in pleasant diversions. Martin Luther King was 26 years old, and he was on his way to become the pastor, 25 years old, excuse me, the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he would become known to the world approximately a year later as the organizer of the Montgomery bus boycott, or at least the primary spokesman for it. But you don't hear anything here about segregation, and you don't hear anything here about the problem of being afraid on the road. You just hear about Donizetti and Lucia di Lammermoor and his having this happy experience of hearing music. Whatever we may think about Donizetti, for example. But what King is getting at is this is the mentality of the free man. That idea of pursuing a life that is based on that concept of freedom is very important. And in the proceedings at the International Court of Justice a few days ago, the Honorable Ronald Lamola, Minister of Justice of the Republic of South Africa, said the following. In our delegation, we have Palestinians who are victims of the current bloodbath that the government of Israel is perpetrating. They have come here to symbolically appeal for protection from this court. We trust that after hearing us presenting the facts, the legal arguments, the truth, the court will grant them the protection they seek. The arc of the moral universe is long, always bending towards justice, said Dr. Martin Luther King. We will continue to support the cause of just law as a means to ensuring justice for all. I think the reason that the universe bends towards justice is that the universe is beautiful. And as Shelley said, truth is beauty, beauty, truth. Persons like King and persons like those that presented the case at the Hague, persons like the German farmers that are standing up as they are standing up, are persons that are standing on this idea that that beautiful universe and its truth is a greater power than any tyranny. And if we act in the practice of the image of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose birthday we will celebrate this Monday, January 15th, surely the world will be a better place. On behalf of the LaRouche organization and the Manhattan Project, we say good afternoon to you, and we'll see you here again next week.